My name's Andy Hobsbawm. I'm co-founder of dothegreenthing.com, which is a service to inspire people to lead greener lives, and we do that by using great pieces of creativity to try and get people to see that a sustainable life is something that's worthwhile in its own right, rather than just something that they feel they ought to do. I think Green Thing's mantra is something we call creativity versus climate change, and the idea behind that is that there's a incredibly powerful force of creativity in everyday life that shapes a lot of what we do in society, and certainly shapes a lot of what we do economically, and it comes from an industrialized world where many of the products and to some extent services that exist actually are quite carbon intensive, and they're not particularly sustainable. And this creativity in the form of whether it be communications or business innovation or research and development is an incredibly powerful force that happens to be pushing in the direction of unsustainable living, because of the way that the society and economy has evolved. And we felt that it was very important to try and do our bit to create an equal and opposite force, if you like, to push in the other direction, and actually use the same tools and techniques, the same sort of creative magic that can pick people up in one place and put them down in another place, and sort of reframe the way they look at things and the way that they create meaning out of things and engage with it, and the way that helps them live their lives, professionally and personally, and use some of that same those same ingredients, that same force, to tell the other side of the story, if you like, to create a more sustainable way of living. And so we try and use either the best of creative talent that's out there, which is very sort of generously donated to the cause, because we're a sort of a not-for-profit registered charity. So artists and musicians and film directors and just people with great creative minds help us do things like launch campaigns, either come up with products, as we recently did with Glove Love, where we take single gloves and pair them together to create new sustainable pairs, or create sort of disruptive media campaigns that try and take ideas that people have and couch them in a different way. So transportation is one example where walking is something we like to promote, or other forms of transport other than the car where you can. And so there's a soundtrack to driving, which is drive time music on the radio, and there's a real link between motor cars and music. So we wanted to create an association between walking and music. So a bunch of musicians wrote walking soundtracks for us, songs at 105 beats per minute, which we mixed together into a walkcast that you can download and stick on your iPod while you meander around. So those are sort of very different ways that we try and use the engine of creativity, if you like, to create a force that pushes in the opposite direction and really makes people want to lead a greener life, because actually it's cleverer, funnier, healthier, happier, and a better way to be. I suppose with climate change, it's in some senses it's a problem, like many other kinds of problems that have been tackled in the past or need to be tackled, and just happens to be obviously an incredibly big, global and very difficult problem. But I think the same sort of mechanics apply. So roughly speaking, there are three actors, aren't they? The state, the market, and the citizen slash consumer, and maybe you could say NGOs are a fourth player, but let's sort of simplify it. We could say there are three, and I think each has their role to play. There's certain things that simply can't happen without regulation and policy. On the other hand, that policy is clearly going to be driven by a sense of what citizens want as voters, and what business wants, what industry wants, and industry and the market's going to be driven by what consumers want, and so these things all sort of play off each other. I think the key question is sort of how do you catalyse that change, and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that creativity has a very powerful role to play, because it it sort of has the power to connect in very deep ways that other things don't, you know, and in fact, I think increasingly you look at all the latest research about how the brain works and how people really make decisions and process information, and the process of sort of cognition and creating meaning in the world is a very emotional process. You know, that there really isn't this sort of left brain, right brain distinction, and a lot of the sort of much more linear, mechanical ideas about how we make decisions are really now being shown to not be the case. You know, an extreme example being the whole kind of rational human economic theory that, you know, everybody makes decisions based on inputs about, you know, what the risk is and the cost, and these sort of very binary inputs that then leads you to make the right decision, and that's clearly not the way human beings work. And so all of that, I think, makes us feel that creativity is a very, very powerful way of trying to understand how to frame things and sort of package and deliver them in ways that it really connects with people and makes them want to engage and want to act. So obviously, in terms of policy for government, it's incredibly important to do that, because it's the difference between something being effective and not effective. And I think if you look at the amount of investment that's going into solving climate change with technology, which is incredibly important, there really isn't a comparable investment, it seems to us and a lot of people we talk to, that's going into the sort of culture, you know, cultural and creative industries to actually help people change their behaviour to adopt those technologies and to want to engage with them. An example that a chap speaking to just the day before yesterday at an event called Rory Sutherland, who, you know, makes the point about speed cameras and you know, the cost of speed cameras and the effectiveness of speed cameras in compared to a system which has been piloted, and he seemed to think the stats were that it was a tenth of the cost and it was twice the effectiveness, where instead of speed cameras they showed a display of how fast you were driving and how fast in relation to whether that was above or below or at the norm that everybody else was driving, with a kind of smiley face if you were sort of at the speed limit and a frown if you were above the speed limit. And, you know, that's an interesting illustration of sort of carrot versus stick, where, you know, stick is you know, you will be punished if you do not adhere to these rules, and even if people comply, the effectives, they don't like it. And actually, what's interesting about speed cameras is I think nobody really believes that they're actually breaking the law in a meaningful way if they speed. I bet you if you ask people, they think that speeding or parking fines, these are sort of not really laws that you should adhere to make society better. They're just sort of inconvenient things that politicians put there, and if you can get away with it, great. Which isn't a good state of being. It just means people will snap back to the wrong behaviours given any chance, such as a stretch of motorway without cameras on it, for example. Whereas the other approach is, you know, using social norms, sort of encouraging people and letting people know in a positive way, actually, most people behave this way, is an incredibly powerful inducement, and uses, you know, a lot of sort of behavioural psychology, if you like, to get the same effect, or in fact a better effect. So that's an example of where you could argue sort of creativity or a creative approach to problem solving can really, really help government and policy making. You know, there's an interesting parallel somebody pointed out once, I can't remember, that you could argue that voting has a similar problem. Like, you know, people shouldn't feel that voting makes a difference, because actually an individual vote probably doesn't, unless you're in, you know, some sort of very marginal constituency. Yet people vote, and let's leave aside the fact that people don't vote as much as they did, and, you know, that's a separate point, I think. But, you know, look at America recently with Obama. I mean, people can, you know, reverse that trend if there's something to vote about, perhaps. But people vote because they believe that their participation in something, even though individually may not actually be significant, if you look at it as, will that action itself cause something that will change an outcome, they believe that their participation in that whole process is important and meaningful. And so, you know, it's not impossible that connection can be made, and I think we need to figure out how to make that same connection with climate change. The final thought I have on this, again, is on behalf of this behavioural psychology, is a lot of the messaging about climate change tends to normalise the behaviours that we don't want people to do. So when you talk about 58 billion plastic bottles are thrown away every day, the message you're giving people is actually most people do that. And that tends to reinforce the fact that that's the kind of thing that everyone else does, so it must be all right. So, framing things positively by, for example, saying, even one person that does X can make a difference, I think can help people to understand that actually their contribution, has power and can make a difference and can contribute. If you think about something as simple as a message that a lot of people are putting out, which is this is good for your wallet and good for the planet, that's actually psychologically flawed, because if you say to somebody this is good for your wallet, you're triggering all sorts of associations and all sorts of references which are all about them and how they're doing the stuff that they have, the stuff that them and the people in their immediate family have, how they live, what they own, how much they make, all of this kind of stuff, which is very much based on materialism and the market and so on. And at the same time, you're asking them to say and think about what that does for the planet, which is a completely different frame of reference. It's about you contributing to something greater than yourself. So I think it's very interesting that maybe one of the other ways that we can use to connect with people is by understanding these sort of deeply embedded sort of psychological frames of reference and models that people use unknowingly or unconsciously, and sort of try and trigger the right associations and for example, appeal to the fact that people are all part of one greater system. A sort of a deep truth that people I think realise is that we're not all really individuals. We're actually all part of a system, be that the natural world in which we live or the society in which we inhabit, that the no man is an island type of thing. And I think there's a way of triggering that narrative, if you like, and making people connect with information about climate change based on that frame of reference. Copenhagen is it's a bit depressing, really, thinking about Copenhagen, given the news that's coming out. On the other hand, important to remain positive. And I think, Copenhagen is clearly absolutely critical in many ways. On the other hand, it probably won't be everything that we need it to be or want it to be. So I think one has to be also hopeful that Copenhagen is a step in the process. And so, for example, it seems unlikely that Obama is going to come to Copenhagen with any kind of ratified agreement domestically, which will then allow him to make sort of international commitments. Maybe he'll have enough agreement to do that, but it doesn't look that way at the moment. I think somebody mentioned the other day, actually, and I thought this was very interesting, if controversial statement, that maybe it would be better if Copenhagen failed rather dismally, because if Copenhagen failed, there would be a sort of an outcry and people would say, well, what are we going to do? Who's going to solve this? The danger is that Copenhagen won't actually achieve the meaningful sort of legally binding agreements that we need. That's sort of what makes Copenhagen potentially significant, is that it's legal documents that then have a much greater chance of people complying with them than press releases that might come out of a G20 summit or something. And the danger is that they won't really reach the meaningful binding legal agreements, but they'll obviously message to the world that they've achieved meaningful steps, because that's politics. And then the world will go, phew, they've sorted it, the scientists and the government are on it, I don't need to worry about it, that problem's gone away, which would almost be the worst of both worlds. It'd be a double loss. You'd have not enough progress, and then you'd take away that sort of public mandate and pressure for progress to be made. So I thought that was an interesting point about perhaps if it failed spectacularly, it might be more constructive than it succeeding a bit, but obviously not as constructive as if it succeeded hugely, but that seems less likely, unfortunately. Unless we fix climate change and keep us from reaching this tipping point, so we keep climate change manageable, unless we do that, I would argue no other issues are really particularly relevant because we'll have more problems to worry about. If you say what is the most pressing issues if we do manage to keep warming under 2 degrees, then I think there's a whole other range of answers, but I'll be happy to answer them once we've reached that point.